Thank you very much, Bill, for that very kind and generous introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out and the wonderful Utah hospitality I've enjoyed since I've been here. I think my talk, which is going to focus on the impact of the Tet Offensive of January 1968 on the Vietnam War and on American politics and society, fits rather well in the broad theme of turning points. I will suggest tonight, and it's not certainly a new interpretation, that this really represents the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong offensive, which was launched beginning on January 30th and 31st, 1968. The key triggering event which set in motion a series of very difficult decisions within the Johnson administration and throughout American society, which led to a very consequential decision, which is what I will end with tonight. And that's a decision that President Lyndon Johnson reached and announced to the public in a nationwide speech on March 31st of 1968, indicating that the United States would pursue peace negotiations with North Vietnam, that it would set a ceiling on U.S. troop levels in South Vietnam, which at that point had reached 550,000 military personnel, and also that he, Lyndon Johnson, would take himself out of the presidential race of 1968. This represents a very sharp change from where Lyndon Johnson was as the year 1968 began, when he had orchestrated a very public campaign indicating to the American public that all was going well in Vietnam, that there was proverbial light at the end of the tunnel, and certainly it was his full expectation to be triumphantly reelected for a second full term in November of 1968. All of that unravels as a result of a North Vietnamese and Viet Cong coordinated offensive that in military terms is actually a defeat for America's enemy, but in political and psychological terms amounted to a significant blow to the United States. So that's the subject of my talk today. And let me begin with some context. Toward the end of 1967, the Vietnam War, by any reasonable standard of measurement, had become stalemated. It is certainly clear in retrospect, as it was to many observers at the time, that the United States and its South Vietnamese allies were nowhere close to winning what had essentially become a guerrilla war or an insurgent war. But neither were their adversaries, the North Vietnamese and the southern-based revolutionary insurgency, the National Liberation Front, or what Americans more typically referred to as the Viet Cong. 2.5 years after the major U.S. troop buildup in Vietnam, insurgent forces still controlled substantial portions of the territory and population of the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam. In a report on January 1st of 1968, Marine General John Chason, who was the director of the Operations Center of the U.S. Military Command in Vietnam, estimated that nearly 90% of the geographic areas of the Republic of Vietnam and over 1/3 of the population were under communist influence. That was an alarming figure. Now, 90% were under the influence, did not mean they were under the control, but 90% of the territory of South Vietnam was still under the influence of communists 2.5 years after the major U.S. military buildup. The armed forces of North Vietnam and the National Liberation Front had made the tactical adjustments needed to survive a conflict against an adversary, the United States, that could bring to bear vastly superior firepower and technology. The leaders and the people of North Vietnam had likewise adapted to the punishing U.S. bombing campaign, which had commenced in February of 1965. They had demonstrated firm resolve even in the face of a sustained aerial assault that they lacked the military means to counter. Yet the leaders of North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, the figurehead leader, and Le Duan, the Communist Party boss who was making most of the key day-to-day strategic and political decisions, revolutionaries all, were sufficiently realistic to recognize that no matter how much territory south of the 17th parallel remained under the de facto control of communist cadres, their forces could never hope to defeat the United States. Now, victory had appeared within their grasp in early 1965, only to be snatched away by the massive infusion of U.S. troops that had helped prop up the faltering Saigon regime. Specialists on the Vietnam War still, as Professor Cobb noted, disagree on many things, but they agree on this one, that had the United States not intervened in early 1965, the Vietnam War most likely would have come to an end with the triumph of the Viet Cong and the collapse of the Saigon regime. U.S. troops were sent to prevent that eventuality, and U.S. troops succeeded in achieving that goal of propping up the Saigon regime. Realizing that victory was by no means imminent, America's communist adversaries dug in for the long term. They hoped that determination and patience and time, especially time, would prove to be on their side. After all, they didn't need to defeat the American superpower. They simply needed to stay in the fight. They simply needed not to lose. By denying a victory to the Americans and by controlling their own rate of casualties by avoiding traditional military confrontations, they could wage a protracted war, inflict significant casualties on their adversaries, and simply wait for American public opinion to turn against a bloody, inconclusive war in a faraway place. That represents the essence of their strategy from the inception of the major American escalation in the first half of 1965. And much to President Lyndon B. Johnson's consternation, ample evidence suggested during the second half of 1967 that public opinion was beginning to turn against the Vietnam War, that it was conforming, in fact, to the pattern that Hanoi's leaders had predicted and that they were banking on. Americans were growing weary and frustrated with a conflict whose cost in blood and treasure was becoming as worrisome as its inconclusiveness. There are a lot of ways that you can measure this. Aggregate public opinion polls are one way. By October 1967, a public opinion poll revealed that support for the war had reached a new low of 58%. The previous month, it had stood at 61%, and the month before that, it had stood at 72%. So for Lyndon Johnson, the graph of what was happening toward American public opinion was not moving in a positive direction. In October of 1967, polls indicated as well that for the first time, a plurality of Americans, by the close margin of 46 to 44%, believed that the Vietnam War had been a mistake, that the initial decision to intervene in Vietnam had been a mistake. Only 34% of Americans approved of Lyndon Johnson's handling of the war. The other 66% either believed that Johnson should move more quickly toward negotiations or believed alternatively the hawkish view that he should escalate the war more dramatically, more aggressively in an effort to bring it to a close. So you find public opinion bifurcating on this issue between what were called at the time hawks and doves, and support for Johnson's more middle ground position, if you want to term it that, gradually eroding. Newspapers throughout the country were beginning to turn against the war as well. The number of newspapers and news magazines that had called in their editorial pages for negotiations were growing. And perhaps most worrisome for Lyndon Johnson, support for the war within the Congress had begun to erode. The Christian Science Monitor in mid-1967 did an informal poll of congressmen and senators, and they found that 44 senators supported Lyndon Johnson's Vietnam War policy, while 40 opposed it. And what was particularly worrisome to Lyndon Johnson is that the ranks of anti-war senators and congressmen were swelling, but those ranks were peopled especially by representatives from within his own political party. So it was not opposition Republicans so much as it was fellow Democrats that were beginning to oppose Lyndon Johnson's Vietnam policy. This created what in many respects was an unprecedented historical situation. For those of you who can remember back to the days of the Iraq War, when George W. Bush was president, you could count, you wouldn't need a hand to count the number of Republican members of the Congress who opposed the U.S. war in Iraq. Unless I am mistaken, every single Republican senator and every single Republican congressman supported President George W. Bush's war in Iraq. The only opposition came from the opposition party. The Vietnam War was not that way. In fact, you find the Democratic Party fracturing on the Vietnam War, which is deeply worrisome to Lyndon Johnson, because the party was also fracturing on the major domestic issue of that time, the civil rights movement. So one of the ways in which what I'm going to discuss today is a turning point is not just in terms of the Vietnam War, not just in terms of American foreign policy, but also significantly in terms of American domestic politics. Lyndon Johnson had won an overwhelming electoral mandate in November of 1964, and his party enjoyed sizable majorities in both houses of Congress. But the most vocal and vociferous criticism of Johnson's policies was coming from fellow Democrats, not opposition Republicans. Now, for a president as notoriously attentive to swings in public opinion as Johnson, and one who would be facing voters again soon in November of 1968, those trends bore ominous portents. In October of 1967, one of LBJ's most trusted domestic political advisors, Harry McPherson, observed that many Americans have grown increasingly edgy about the bombing program over North Vietnam. He called it one of the main causes of disaffection with our Vietnam policy and warned his boss that the United States looked to many like a big mechanized white nation obliterating a small agricultural brown nation. Significant and visible military progress was needed, Johnson was convinced, in order to turn public opinion in a more favorable direction and thereby to enhance his reelection prospects. But he was receiving conflicting testimony about progress in the Vietnam War from within his own policymaking circle. Although most of his top military and political and diplomatic advisors, including Secretary of State Dean Rusk, National Security Advisor Walt W. Rostow, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs General Earl Wheeler, and Commanding General in Vietnam William Westmoreland, insisted that the United States was making steady progress in Vietnam and that the enemy was reeling. The enemy was on his heels. Not all senior officers and not all intelligence experts subscribed to so optimistic a view. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, most significantly, who had long been the most visible public proponent of the war effort, had become the most significant dissenter within the administration by the end of 1967. On November 1st of 1967, he sent Johnson a very pessimistic memorandum in which he spelled out his own pessimistic views about the war. In the memorandum, McNamara warned that continuing our present course will not bring us, by the end of 1968, enough closer to success in the eyes of the American public to prevent the continued erosion of popular support for our involvement in Vietnam. McNamara had, in fact, come to see the Vietnam War as an unwinnable morass for the United States. He believed that the bombing campaign, which he had so powerfully advocated in 1964 and 1965, was failing. He believed that the data told him that it wasn't interrupting the flow of men and supplies to the battlefield in the South. It wasn't stabilizing the political situation in South Vietnam, nor was it succeeding in breaking the enemy's will. Nothing can be expected to break that will, he told Johnson, other than the conviction that they cannot win. And the American public, frustrated by the slow rate of progress, fearing continued escalation, and doubting that all approaches to peace have been sincerely probed, does not have the appearance of having the will to persist. In short, McNamara, once the war's principal architect, did not believe that the United States could achieve its objectives any longer. And shockingly, he proposed that the United States shift course to a policy of stabilization by capping U.S. troop levels, by permitting no further expansion of the air war against North Vietnam, and by actively pursuing peace negotiations. Now, McNamara's views were minority views, to be sure, within Johnson's inner circle. And Johnson looked outside his inner circle to a group of so-called wise men, former policymakers who had considerable stature, people like former Secretary of State Dean Acheson, former Secretary of the Treasury C. Douglas Dillon, and former Washington hand Clark Clifford, as well as McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor for John F. Kennedy and then later Lyndon Johnson. They received a series of briefings from top Pentagon and CIA and State Department officials late in 1967, and they rendered their verdict to Johnson. If we keep the pressure on them, gradually the will of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese will wear down. Acheson expressed the view that the war seemed to be going well for the United States. When these fellows decide they can't defeat the South, Acheson said, then they will give up. This is the way it was in Korea, he said, and he was Secretary of State during the Korean War. This is the way the communists operate. So this continued to be the prevailing conventional wisdom at the highest levels of the American government, that there was a breaking point, and that North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, once they reached that breaking point, would look for peace negotiations and would accept a negotiated settlement that would be favorable to U.S. interests. That, I hasten to emphasize, was always America's maximal goal. It wasn't to force the unconditional surrender of North Vietnam, or to invade and occupy North Vietnam, or to defeat every insurgent on the ground in South Vietnam. That would never have been an achievable goal, and it was never the U.S. goal. The U.S. goal was to shift the fortunes of the war, to reach what Westmoreland referred to as the crossover point, in which enemy casualties and deaths occurred at a rate higher than the enemy's ability to replace those men being lost in the field. That would then break the will and determination of the North Vietnamese and their Viet Cong allies. That would in turn lead Hanoi, and presumably its big power backers in Moscow and Beijing, to enter into a series of negotiations with the United States that would lead to a favorable political settlement. That was Johnson's fondest hope. And he kept receiving data through the end of 1967 that was contradictory. Some of the highest-ranking analysts at the CIA believed, as McNamara did, that the war was going poorly, that there were significant enemy forces in the field, and that Westmoreland was in fact undercounting them, underestimating the enemy's order of battle, the array of forces that the United States faced. Analysts in the CIA also thought that the bombing was proving counterproductive, and that the flow of men and supplies, despite 2.5 years of intensive American bombing, had not significantly been slowed down. So one view was, and in retrospect, this was the accurate view, was that at the rate of casualties that were being inflicted on the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, they could continue to fight this war indefinitely. The issue was, would they maintain the will and determination to continue to fight given the number of casualties that they were sustaining? McNamara came to believe that they could and would fight indefinitely. The optimists still proved to be very influential on Lyndon Johnson. Now, Westmoreland's fighting strategy pivoted on an imagined crossover point, which was the juncture, the mathematical juncture, if you will, at which North Vietnamese and Viet Cong losses began to exceed their ability to replace those losses. This led to one of the many controversies of the war over how many enemy forces, in fact, there were. It's not as if Westmoreland deliberately cooked the books, as it were, but he did have a natural human tendency to want to exaggerate the number of enemy casualties being inflicted, and to also undercount the total number of enemy forces arrayed against the United States. That data would allow him to reach the crossover point sooner. And there was a major controversy within the American government over this issue, the so-called order of battle controversy, which some of you will recall led to a CBS documentary in the 1990s in which Westmoreland believed he was maligned. He sued CBS. It led to a major trial, and it led to a boon for historians because we got a treasure trove of documents relating to intelligence matters in the Vietnam War much earlier than we ever would have. Now, while all of this is going on, the president himself, Lyndon Johnson, harbored substantial private doubts about the course of the war. He hoped that one of the various peace probes that he had supported going back to 1966 would ultimately bear fruit, that the North Vietnamese would sit down and begin negotiating with the United States, and that he could find a positive way out of the war which would lead to a settlement favorable to American interests. Of course, the fundamental problem with that is that the issue that had to be negotiated was who will rule in South Vietnam. And there were really three possibilities. The communists would rule in South Vietnam. The anti-communist government that the Americans supported, the Saigon regime, would continue to rule, or the differences would be split, and there would be some form of a coalition government, some form of a power-sharing arrangement. Power sharing and a coalition government was anathema to the United States. So when Johnson talked about negotiations, the ultimate end that he sought was for North Vietnam to remove its troops from the South, and there were hundreds of thousands of North Vietnamese troops in the South, and that it would agree to support a non-communist regime. So that negotiated end game was one that, from the North Vietnamese perspective, would represent a defeat for them. What they were fighting for, ultimately, was a communist government in South Vietnam. They would probably accept some form of a power-sharing arrangement, some diplomatic settlement that would allow communists a role in the government. But the Americans would never accept that, and America's South Vietnamese allies would never accept that. But these issues would never be faced by Lyndon Johnson. It would be Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger who would be forced to confront the issues of what a negotiated settlement would actually look like between 1969 and 1973. Well, the North Vietnamese in July of 1967 made a bold decision. They decided that they would try and break the political and military stalemate in Vietnam by initiating a series of bold strikes across the length and breadth of South Vietnam. By doing so, they would bring the war to the cities, and the war up to this point had largely been fought in the rural areas of South Vietnam, in the countryside. The cities had been largely exempt from intensive fighting, and the cities had grown ever larger as a result of the American presence, as a result of peasants fleeing the countryside for greater security in the cities, or fleeing to the cities for greater economic opportunities and personal freedoms. If successful, the North Vietnamese Viet Cong attacks would inspire a popular uprising against what Hanoi's rulers invariably denigrated as South Vietnam's puppet government. One North Vietnamese official at the time put it clearly when he privately said, "We can only win at the negotiating table what we have already won on the battlefield." We can only win at the negotiating table what we have already won on the battlefield. And that's the essence of North Vietnam's political and military strategy, to strike a military blow which would alter the negotiating environment in such a way that it would make possible a settlement favorable to the interests of North Vietnam. Or if the maximum goal of the offensive was achieved, the offensive in the cities would lead to a popular uprising on the part of ordinary South Vietnamese against this government that they were convinced was illegitimate, nothing more than an American puppet. And the combination of the popular uprising and the North Vietnamese Viet Cong military actions would topple the Saigon regime and create a circumstance in which the United States would have little choice but to negotiate the terms of its own withdrawal from South Vietnam. That was their maximum goal. Their minimal goal was to make it clear that after 2.5 years of punishing American attacks, they still had substantial military capabilities. And the audience they saw for their attacks from the beginning was the American public. They thought they could make it clear to the American public that this was, at best, a protracted, stalemated conflict that the United States was nowhere near winning. They began their planning for Tet with a series of diversionary attacks, particularly a major one in Khe Sanh in the rugged mountains near Laos in South Vietnam's northwestern corner. And that succeeded in drawing substantial U.S. troops to the area. Johnson, in fact, became obsessed with the siege of the Marine garrison at Khe Sanh, fearing that the North Vietnamese were trying to create another military victory, such as the Dien Bien Phu blow that they dealt to the French in 1954. And while this was going on, the real attack took place, and it included approximately 84,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops who launched a series of well-coordinated attacks throughout South Vietnam, beginning in the early morning hours of January 31st of 1968. They struck 5 of the 6 major cities of South Vietnam, 36 of the 44 provincial capitals, 64 of the 242 district centers, and numerous smaller towns and hamlets throughout the country. A focal point of the attack was the capital city of Saigon, where North Vietnamese analysts believed that the sudden assault on a number of strategic sites, including the U.S. Embassy and the Presidential Palace, as well as the main Air Force base in the city, would spark a popular uprising that would undercut and hopefully even topple the regime of Nguyen Van Thu, the South Vietnamese leader that the Americans were backing. Particularly audacious about the Viet Cong assault was the attack on the American embassy, which served as one of the most potent symbols of the U.S. presence within Vietnam. Several hours before dawn on January 31st, a Viet Cong sapper team blew a large hole in the wall surrounding the embassy, entered the compound's courtyard, and over the next 6 hours exchanged heavy rocket and small arms fire with U.S. military, police, and Marines. In the mid-afternoon of January 30th, Washington time, National Security Advisor Walt Rostow left a policy meeting on Vietnam with President Johnson and other senior advisors to take an urgent telephone call from Saigon. He returned to inform President Johnson that, quote, "we are being heavily mortared in Saigon." According to a flash cable just received from the National Military Intelligence Coordination Center, the U.S. Embassy, the Presidential Palace, and the city of Saigon itself were all under attack. "This could be very bad," Johnson muttered. This was a strategic surprise. By most reasonable renderings, this was an intelligence failure, one of the most significant of the Cold War era, perhaps the most significant of the entire Vietnam War. It wasn't that American intelligence analysts had completely failed to pick up the signals that the enemy was planning something significant. They simply underestimated the breadth and the number of troops that would be involved. They underestimated the enemy's ambition, the enemy's audacity, and the enemy's ability to coordinate a series of attacks across the length and breadth of South Vietnam. Initial administration assessments seemed to confirm the president's snap reaction. In an intelligence memorandum that the CIA circulated within the first 24 hours of the attacks, they'd soberly described the Tet Offensive as designed to demonstrate North Vietnamese and Viet Cong strength and resiliency while dealing a psychological blow to the United States and its South Vietnamese partners, which, as an instantaneous intelligence assessment, was exactly on target. They went on to say that Hanoi evidently sought to convey the impression that despite Viet Cong problems and despite 500,000 U.S. troops, the communists are still powerful and capable of waging war. The CIA's senior Vietnam specialist, George A. Carver, added that no matter how effective U.S. and South Vietnamese forces ultimately proved in their counterattacks, and they would prove to be extremely effective in their counterattacks, the initial success of the commando operations would provide a substantial boost to North Vietnamese and Viet Cong morale. And Carver really hit the nail on the head with this instant analysis. He said, regardless of what happens tonight or in the next few days, the degree of success already achieved in Saigon and around the country will adversely affect the image of the government of Vietnam and its powerful American allies as well in the eyes of the people. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who had already offered his resignation to Lyndon Johnson but was still serving in that post, told Johnson that the carefully planned offensive showed that the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong have more power than some credit them with. And he immediately grasped the highly damaging psychological and public relations effects that the attacks were sure to have. Although McNamara confidently anticipated that U.S. and South Vietnamese forces would counterattack and inflict a heavy defeat on the attackers, and he was right on that score, he nonetheless expected America's adversaries to score a significant psychological victory. He said, I imagine our people across the country this morning will feel they're much stronger, meaning the enemy, than they had previously anticipated they were. And in that sense, I think they, the enemy, will gain. Again, he was absolutely correct, like Carver, in sensing that the psychological impact of the offensive would be profound regardless of how successful the American and South Vietnamese counterattack ultimately was. There were many weaknesses in the communist offensive. Operating under the cover of the Tet Lunar New Year's celebrations and accompanying ceasefire, they achieved almost total strategic surprise. But they failed to establish strong defensive positions. They received little support from the local population, which was one of the premises of their operation, that this would trigger widespread popular support. It didn't happen. And they soon succumbed to the greater mobility and the overwhelming firepower of the American and South Vietnamese defenders. At the embassy in Saigon, in less than 24 hours, all 19 of the commandos that fought their way into the U.S. Embassy grounds were killed in counterattacks mounted by American soldiers, airmen, and military police. And a similar pattern obtained in Saigon and throughout the country, with the major exception of the city of Hue, in which the attackers dug in, and it took a very protracted and bloody counteroffensive on the part of the Americans before they could be dislodged. What I want to talk about in the time remaining is why the Tet attacks had the kind of political and psychological impact that they had, leading in just 2 months, March 31st of 1968, for Lyndon Johnson essentially to shift course in the war in a very fundamental fashion. Part of the problem, of course, is that Johnson had oversold the American public on the progress that was being made in an effort to make a dent in those public opinion trends that were moving in a negative direction during the final months of 1967. Because Johnson had so recently brought home Commanding General William Westmoreland and the U.S. ambassador in Saigon, Ellsworth Bunker, to give a series of public speeches emphasizing the progress, because Johnson himself had recently traveled to South Vietnam and famously said, "The enemy has met his master." He had actually inflated the sense among the public that there were hopeful trends in the war. In this explosive context, in which a number of newspapers and major TV stations were beginning to carry editorials and accounts that were critical of U.S. policy, General William Westmoreland makes a private request to General Earl Wheeler, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, for 206,000 additional troops for South Vietnam. Wheeler fully endorsed Westmoreland's troop request and added to it a request for the mobilization of 265,000 reserve troops to build up a depleted reserve force that the Joint Chiefs and the military brass had grown increasingly concerned about in recent months. In a series of meetings at the highest levels of the Johnson administration, the new Secretary of Defense designate, the man who was meant to be McNamara's replacement, Clark Clifford, started asking some very tough questions. He called attention in one to what he described as a very strange contradiction between what the administration was saying and doing in the aftermath of the Tet Offensive. He said, I think we should give some very serious thought to how we explain saying on the one hand that the enemy did not take a victory, and yet we are in need of many more troops and possibly an emergency call-up of reserves. And he really put his finger on a core contradiction. The administration was spinning the Tet Offensive in public as the enemy coming out into the open, which is what the Americans had long hoped for. A major defeat was inflicted on the enemy. Progress was thereby being hastened. And yet, Westmoreland said we need more than 250,000 additional troops, and we need to call up another 250,000 plus reserve troops. Well, important voices in the Congress and in the media reacted with even greater skepticism than did Clark Clifford toward the administration's claims that the Tet Offensive represented an unequivocal military triumph for the United States. When White House officials tried to convince Senator George Aiken of Vermont, for instance, that the enemy had just suffered a major reverse, the crusty Vermont Republican responded sarcastically, "If this is a failure, I hope the Viet Cong never have a major success." And Senator Robert F. Kennedy of New York gave a major speech on February 8th in which he pilloried administration policy and called immediately for negotiations with the North Vietnamese. He said the United States appeared unable to defeat our enemy or break his will, at least without a huge, long, and ever more costly war. And so the contradictions in the administration's approach to the war, which were increasingly being savaged by some of its most prominent critics, more liberals and more Democrats, I emphasize, than conservatives and Republicans. So Johnson was taking flack from his own political allies, or putative political allies. And that hurt particularly heavily for the politically savvy Johnson. So he dispatched Wheeler to South Vietnam for 3 intensive days of consultations with Westmoreland. And when Wheeler came home, he formally transmitted Westmoreland's request for additional troops. This really brings the issue to a head. Johnson calls for Clifford to head a task force that would examine the proposal for more troops in the context of a broader A to Z review of Vietnam policy. And the tough-minded Clifford seized this timely opportunity to conduct a truly wide-ranging reassessment of Vietnam policy. He was a Johnson intimate, a consummate Washington insider who had served in Democratic administrations or advised Democratic presidents going back to Harry S. Truman. He was unusually well-positioned to conduct this wide-ranging review. And he asked a series of tough questions. He stressed that the request for more than 200,000 additional troops for service in Vietnam brought the president to a clearly defined watershed, the turning point of tonight's title, in other words. He said the members of his task force shared a deep-seated concern about the value of such large numbers of fresh military personnel toward the ultimate achievement of the U.S. goal of a viable, self-sustaining Vietnam. We must look at the overall impact on us, Clifford said, including the situation here in the United States. We must look at our economic stability, our other problems in the world, and our other problems at home. Those problems politically just seem to mount when Democratic Senator Eugene McCarthy, a relatively little-known figure, scored a major, or nearly scored a major upset over Lyndon Johnson in the first primary of the 1968 election campaign in New Hampshire. And then on March 16th, Robert Kennedy threw his hat in the ring. And to make matters worse, the administration was suffering from roiling economic and financial problems, a ballooning trade deficit, spiraling inflation, and a record run on America's gold reserves. I don't have the time to go into all of those issues in any depth, but suffice it to say that the Tet fallout exacerbated all of those economic and financial problems as it was simultaneously exacerbating Johnson's political problems. He was being besieged from his own political party, from both the left in terms of Robert Kennedy, Eugene McCarthy, and their allies and supporters, and the right in the figure of George Wallace, a former segregationist Democratic governor of Alabama, who was mounting a third-party ticket bid for the White House in his so-called Independence Party. And Wallace was, to many, a one-issue candidate. He was railing against the impact of integration and civil rights reform on the South. But this was deeply worrisome to Johnson and to any Democrat who had relied for more than a generation on support electorally from the solidly Democratic South. Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield cautioned Johnson in a private memorandum that to increase the defense budget, which would be essential to call up more than 200,000 more troops, would mean more inflation, more balance of payments complications, and possibly financial panic and collapse. Walt Rostow, a professional economist and a hawk on the war, cautioned Johnson that the financial problems that the United States was suddenly facing has placed the government in as difficult a situation as I have seen in the past 5 years, and he even made allusions to the financial crisis of the 1930s, which brought the global capitalist system to its knees. This is the situation Johnson faces on the eve of the major address that he gives on March 31st, 1968. Just before then, he brings back the wise men, Dean Acheson, McGeorge Bundy, C. Douglas Dillon, and others. And this time, he hears a very different verdict. We cannot build an independent South Vietnam, Acheson concluded, speaking on behalf of the group. Therefore, we should do something by no later than late summer to establish something different. The issue, he said, cutting to the heart of it, is can we do what we are trying to do in Vietnam? And he answered his own question, I do not think we can. The wise men advocated the policy that Clark Clifford was also pushing for, a policy that, in a word, is best described as disengagement, beginning that painful process of disengagement from Vietnam. In his memoirs, Clark Clifford refers to this as a really epical meeting in terms of capturing the wider significance of the advice the so-called wise men were giving Johnson for disengagement. He said, the men who had helped lay down the basic line of resistance to the expansion of communism in the world, the statesmen of Berlin and Korea, had decided they had had enough in Vietnam. And speaking the classic language of realism, he said, the price, they believed, was no longer commensurate with the goal. And so on March 31st, 1968, Johnson goes on national television and announces that the United States was ceasing nearly all bombing raids against North Vietnam. He then invited Hanoi to enter into formal peace talks with American representatives. He refers in this speech to the current situation as one in which the United States was looking at the sharpest financial threat in the post-war era, a threat to the dollar's role as the keystone of international trade in finance, and echoing Abraham Lincoln's famous speech during the era of the Civil War, he said, as in times before, it is true that a house divided against itself is a house that cannot stand. And so in sum, what occurs in this concentrated period of enormous political, strategic, and economic financial turmoil that follows in the wake of the Tet Offensive is something that I think is best described as a watershed in modern American history. Lyndon Johnson made the decision that the United States was not going to be able to achieve what it set out to achieve in Vietnam with the resources that he thought were available to it. He rejected the option of pouring additional resources into Vietnam because he made a realist calculation. And that was the calculation that additional resources poured into Vietnam would only exacerbate the underlying political, economic, and strategic military problems that the United States faced, and would further erode and undermine America's position as a global superpower. And in this sense, Johnson recognized that Vietnam, after all, as important as it had become, and as deep as the commitment had become, and as much as it had divided Americans, was merely a theater, and a peripheral theater at that, in terms of the broader strategic framework of a Cold War struggle against the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. And as painful as it was for him to make this transition, he began this gradual process of moving toward peace negotiations and beginning to disengage from Vietnam. He never completed that process. Nixon, of course, inherited it, began troop withdrawals, and also pushed toward negotiations. But, of course, it would be 4 long years before the United States would ultimately reach a peace settlement with North Vietnam, and at best, that was a highly imperfect instrument that soon began to unravel as Nixon's presidency unraveled with Watergate. Thanks very much. I'd be delighted to respond to any questions or comments you might have. Thanks. Yeah, well, even if Humphrey had been elected, and of course it was a very close election, I think there would have been more of a sense of continuity, and so that would have been an interesting contrast. I think part of the reason why peace negotiations take so long under Nixon before they reach fruit is that Nixon, Kissinger, and some of their top aides really are not convinced that they can find Hanoi's breaking point. And so they have to go through a process, like the Cambodian incursion of May 1970, in which they look for a way to put more pressure on the enemy to create conditions for a favorable settlement. That said, this is an enemy that wasn't going to be willing to compromise much. And really, there were two things that basically, for 3 years, the North Vietnamese said, we don't have any troops in South Vietnam, and if we did, they wouldn't be foreign troops, and we wouldn't have to remove them. And it's really hard to get beyond that. The American position is there has to be a mutual withdrawal of troops from South Vietnam. So when your adversary is sitting across from you straight-faced and saying, we don't have any troops in South Vietnam, and if we did, they wouldn't be foreign troops. And then they also said, you must dissociate yourself entirely from the two regimes. Well, I think fairly, from the American point of view, that was seen as an act of betrayal, which would frighten other American allies who would think that the United States could so expeditiously ditch this ally. What might it do to us? So that didn't create a conducive atmosphere for negotiations. But Nixon's constant escalations of the war didn't represent the kind of confidence-building measures that you need to progress in any difficult negotiation. So it's hard for me to imagine a circumstance, even under a Humphrey presidency, that would have led to an outcome that would have been anything other than America surrendering to all of North Vietnam's demands. And that's very hard to do. I mean, alternatively, if you look for alternatives, an international conference at a time when American troop levels were at their height, in which you get other great powers involved, Britain, the Soviet Union, China, which create a kind of general settlement such as you had with regard to Laos in 1962, that might have been more promising. And that's what George Ball was advocating back in 1965 when he opposed American intervention, arguing that we're not going to achieve our goals. It's going to be very costly if we go that route. Far better off to settle for a negotiated settlement that we could at least spin as a fair settlement which gives South Vietnam an opportunity to survive. I think in retrospect, that would have been the wiser route to go.
Thank you. Hi, I just had a question about the Vietnam War and our allies.
Sure.
How important were our allies in the Vietnam War? Do you feel like they are often overlooked? And do you feel like they really played a critical role or only a minor role?
Yeah, that's a very important point, and it's often overlooked. Of course, the United States had a number of multilateral Cold War alliances, the most important being NATO. And early on, Johnson worked very hard with our NATO allies in an effort to get even modest troop contingents, and not a single NATO nation was willing to deploy a single soldier to South Vietnam. Johnson was deeply frustrated by that. The British, the Italians, the Dutch, the Danes and other Western allies, the Canadians, believed that the United States was embarking on the wrong path in Vietnam, the French as well, of course, and tried to counsel Johnson against getting involved in the Vietnam War. Not because they thought the goal was unworthy. They were supportive of the goal of trying to back a non-communist South Vietnamese regime. All things being equal, that was a preferred outcome on the part of the United States and virtually all of its allies. Where they differed was on the issue of whether it was a goal that was achievable at a reasonable cost. The Canadians, the British, the French, and others didn't think it was. Where America did get support from allies was from Australia, New Zealand, that for their own reasons were concerned about the spreading influence of communist China in their neighborhood. So they actually shared Johnson's strategic vision and voluntarily contributed troops. South Korea and Thailand also contributed troops, but Johnson needed to pay a price for those troops. He needed to underwrite those troops. And so they were often labeled by critics as mercenaries, which may be an unfair designation, but there was a quid pro quo dimension to South Korean and Thai involvement in Vietnam. The South Koreans send, I think, 50,000 troops to South Vietnam, so it's a significant number. And I'm not sure the exact number of Australian troops, but it's a significant number as well. And in terms of Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, they're allies of the United States in CETO, and South Korea has a bilateral security agreement with the United States. So the United States could certainly say truthfully that this was an allied war in South Vietnam. It wasn't just an American war, but all the major command and control decisions are being made by the United States. That's certainly well understood by everyone. And NATO opposition to the American war, whether vocal or quiet, was deeply irritating to Lyndon Johnson. When Canadian Prime Minister Lester Pearson came to the United States and gave a speech, public speech in Baltimore, criticizing the American bombing campaign, Johnson was infuriated and really gave Pearson a dressing down. You know, according to one account, he said to Pearson at the Johnson Ranch in Texas, you know, you don't come here and piss on my rug, which captures, you know, the kind of vulgar essence of Johnson. That you would talk that way to the leader of one of the most pro-American countries in the world is, I think, speaks volumes about the way in which this war roiled, you know, very strong alliance relationships.
Follow up?
Sure.
I was wondering about, I know that I have a friend who served in Vietnam, but he was Canadian, and I know that the Canadian government really doesn't offer much in the way of benefits. Did other allies not offer those benefits as well, and does the U.S. help those veterans out ever that you know of?
I'm not aware of course, there were no Canadians who served in Vietnam. There were Australian and New Zealanders. No, I believe their governments took care of them. The United States increased its overall economic and military assistance to Thailand and South Korea, and so that created certainly the possibility that those funds could be diverted to you know, support for those veterans of the war. But those would have been decisions made in those countries.
You know, our lecture series is called Turning Points in History, and that term was part of your title. But considering that the Tet Offensive was in early 1968, and the peace treaty with Hanoi wasn't signed until January of 1973, many more thousands of American men and women would die, not to mention the number of Vietnamese who would die. And the war would in fact be widened by President Nixon to become an Indochina war as we moved into Laos and Cambodia. How do we legitimate the Tet Offensive as the turning point. Why do we call it a turning point when it was 5 more years before we got out? Is that just the nature of turning points? Is that human cultures are slow to move, or was it the people who were in leadership roles, or what?
Well, I call it a turning point because I see it as the point in which American leaders recognized that this war could not be won militarily, and that the American public would no longer support the deployment of additional men and resources to the war. And so that called for an alternative policy. Johnson begins that by opening negotiations in Paris in May of 1968. Those negotiations continue under Nixon. Under Nixon, of course, you've got the negotiating track and the military track. So he's withdrawing troops, but he's also periodically escalating the war. I think that's largely to put pressure on the enemy because the enemy is stonewalling at the conference table. And U.S. leverage is gradually receding. I mean, who would want to be a diplomat negotiating with a tough-minded adversary when day by day, week by week, your leverage is eroding? You have fewer and fewer troops on the ground. So if you can't get a peace settlement favorable to your interests when you've got 500,000 troops, how are you going to do it with 400,000? How are you going to do it with 200,000? That's a dilemma that Kissinger in particular faced as Nixon's principal negotiator. And where historians differ, I think, and there's grounds for honest differences of opinion about this, whether Nixon was escalating the war in order to produce favorable circumstances for negotiated settlement, or whether he just never gave up on the idea that there would be a breaking point. And if he could just find that breaking point, this third-rate country was going to offer a settlement favorable to U.S. interests. And the evidence, I think, is somewhat contradictory. And I'm not sure myself how I put that together. It may, in fact, be that it depends on the moment that you're looking at the record. I think there were moments in which Nixon was convinced that wielding more powerful Air Force airstrikes would help. The movement into Cambodia would help. I think the hope, though, is for a breakthrough on the battlefield. And with regard to your question, I think the key validation for my argument that this is a turning point is Nixon's gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops. Nixon comes in, and as Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird makes it clear to him that we must begin to withdraw troops, and the American public will no longer stand for the high number of troops that we have in Vietnam. And so that becomes a policy which, once begun, cannot be reversed. It is not politically feasible for Nixon to deploy additional troops to Vietnam. And that's because I think Tet represented a turning point in terms of American public attitudes. The other way you could validate it is with polling data. By March 1968, you have a majority of the public opposed to the war, and that number just grows over time. So Tet brings about the point in which more people are opposing the war than are supporting the war.
Okay. Time for one more.
Yes, how do you feel the Vietnam conflict as a turning point militarily served as a crucible for the development of special warfare communities? Most notably, JFK developed the SEALs, I believe just before major commitment to the war. I believe the Delta Force was developed out of the Green Beret communities and what they went through the war. How do you feel that acted as a turning point moving forward towards our system now, where we rely heavily on special warfare communities versus as you put it earlier, the professionalism of rank and file soldiers?
Yeah, I think it probably does represent the turning point, because we associate the use of highly trained, extremely mobile, small units of special forces with insurgent-type warfare, not with conventional warfare. And to the extent that Vietnam is the first major insurgent war the United States fights, at least since the Philippine War at the turn of the previous century, it really then becomes the template for what follows, since the United States has been involved in more insurgent wars of this type since the 1960s than conventional wars. The only exception to that general rule is the short Persian Gulf War of 1991. So I think Vietnam did demonstrate, certainly in some of its operations, that special forces could be a very effective tool of influence. And so you certainly see that coming out of the Vietnam War. There's a lot of military lessons, of course, that are learned during the Vietnam War. I think it's striking and strikingly significant that General David Petraeus, who's probably the most celebrated military leader of our time, got a PhD at Princeton University and wrote his dissertation on the Vietnam War. And his application of certain techniques during the surge in the Iraq War, I think, was a direct outgrowth of the lessons that he learned from studying the Vietnam War. He wasn't in the military at the time of the Vietnam War, just shortly after that. But you see that a whole generation of people who've gotten involved in counterinsurgency doctrine have been influenced by studying the Vietnam War. Colonel John Nodgel is one who's written an important book about counterinsurgency warfare in Vietnam and Malaysia. Also, Colonel McMaster, who wrote a book about the failure of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the mid-1960s and was a commander in the Iraq War. He too has been an influential figure behind the development of what's called COIN. And a colleague of mine, Colonel Peter Mansour, who's now a history professor at Ohio State, but previously was an executive officer to General Petraeus during the period of the surge and is now writing a book about the surge. These people all played a significant role and were very much influenced by the lessons of the Vietnam War and by the conceptual insight that, for better or worse, insurgent-type wars, irregular wars, are the most likely conflicts that the American military is going to find itself engaged in as we look into the future. Another?
One more.
Dr. McMahon, I'd just be curious to hear what your take is on the POW-MAI situation, if any of those men are still alive over there.
No.
Thank you.
No. I would bet my house that there are no missing in action prisoners of war in Vietnam today. That's an unfortunate myth which has been constructed by people over time for their own purposes, but all of the evidence we have available to us suggests that that simply is not the case. There are a certain number of people who are unaccounted for, but that's true in all wars, and the number of unaccounted for in the Vietnam War is by far the lowest of any war the United States has fought in its history.
We do have a Vietnam oral history project here. If you're interested in participating in that by helping to record interviews or transcribing after the interviews occur, please see me. I have some little cards up here in the front. Maybe you want to do perhaps an internship with the history department. This might be a way to do that as well. So let me end by saying excellent questions, excellent lecture, very insightful. Would you all join me in thanking Dr. McMahon?